Hey everyone, welcome to session 253 of the Behavioral Observations podcast. You know, if you've ever completed a VB-MAPP at some point in your career, you're familiar with the EESA component of the assessment protocol. In today's podcast, I had the chance to talk with Dr. Barb Esch, who created the Early Echoic Skills Assessment, which has evolved into the standalone product called the Early Echoic Skills Assessment and Program Planner. In this conversation, we talk about how Barb got into behavior analysis in the first place. Along the way, she shared some funny stories about her mentorship from Drs. Michael and Jim Carr. We talked about why she created the original EESA. We talked about who the EESAPP is for and who it's not for, and some fantastic advice for newly minted BCBAs. As a side note, I should point out that I inadvertently used the acronyms EESA and EESAPP interchangeably throughout the conversation. The EESAPP, to be clear, is the current version of the assessment and program planning, so I apologize if I confused anyone by doing that. Back to our conversation, though. In addition to the topics we've mentioned already, we spent a decent amount of time talking about some speech therapy concepts that were definitely new to me, especially the idea of co-articulation. We also talked about the order in which one should target specific skills. To me, this highlights the importance of collaboration, especially if you don't have a strong background in typical speech development. Barb is giving not one but two talks this year at the Verbal Behavior Conference, and I hope you're coming. It's on February 29th and March 1st in Austin, Texas, and you can also join virtually through the Magic of Behavior Live. There's also an amazing pre-conference workshop that's being taught by the incomparable Dr. Lena Slim on March 28th, so lots of good verbal behavior stuff to dig into, and many, many awesome speakers. So to learn more, go to behaviorlive.com/VBC. Today's podcast is brought to you by Behavior University, where they provide university-quality professional development for the busy behavior analyst. Learn more about their webinars, live courses, and much, much more over at behavioruniversity.com/observations. We're also brought to you by HRIC. So if you're looking for a job, or if you're about to graduate, if you're going to move, or if you're just wondering if the grass really is greener on the other side, go to hricolorado.com and schedule a confidential chat with Barb Voss today. And last but not least, if you want to pick up some CEUs by listening to some of your favorite behavioral observations podcasts, well, you can do that and go to behavioralobservations.com/get-CEUs to see the almost 50 events we have available. Okay, that's it for opening remarks. Without any further delay, please enjoy this fun and informative conversation with Dr. Barbara Esch.
Welcome to the Behavioral Observations Podcast, stimulating talk for today's behavior analysts. Now here's your host, Matt Sikoria.
All right, Dr. Barbara Esch, welcome to the Behavioral Observations Podcast. How you doing today?
Thank you. Great. I'm kind of cold here in Michigan.
Yes. We were just chatting before we hit the record button about how it's kind of cold, I guess, just about almost everywhere in the United States right now. And cold being a relative experience, of course, too, depending on where one is. I've seen friends on, social media in like Florida, remarking on what their interpretation of cold is. And it's obviously different than the types of climates you and I are used to. But anyway, we can go. We're not here to talk about the weather, though. We're here to talk about behavior analysis and a lot of other cool things. And I definitely want to talk to you about the Early Echoic Skills and Assessment program that you're kind enough to share with me. But let's start off like we always do on behavioral observations. Tell me a little bit about how you got into behavior analysis, what made you want to pursue it as a profession, and kind of take us up to where you are right now. What are you doing these days?
Yeah, well, the short answer to the last part is these days I'm working on doing lots of training with Early Echoic Skills Assessment. And already I think we're looking ahead to revisions coming out before summertime. So that's kind of cool. But, I was thinking about your question and wasn't quite sure how far back to go, but maybe I can jump over a few years here and there. But when I was an undergraduate at Western Michigan University, I did my major in speech pathology, but my minor was from the behavioral psych department. And so I had a rat lab. and I learned about reinforcement, and I learned about stimulus control. The thing that was missing at the time that I didn't know was anything about verbal behavior, because Mark Sundberg hadn't come on the scene yet. And Jack Michael was certainly lecturing about those sorts of things, but it hadn't really taken off in terms of application. But then somewhere along the line, I married this wonderful person who is a behavior analyst. And when he was getting his PhD at Western, I went along to many of the classes. I sat in on classes with him, mostly Jack classes, which at the time everybody had to line up their tape recorder on a table in front of Jack because he spoke so quickly. But John and I went to a lot of behavioral conferences, and I started it was kind of like trying to put a coat on that didn't fit, but you really wanted to wear that coat. Gradually, I began to see the world more through a behavior analytic lens, largely, I think, because I lived on a daily basis with somebody that knew how to do that, my husband, John, and I really took to heart the classes that I went to that Jack Michael taught. And there were some other folks as well that certainly were speaking very behavior analytically. The entire department was behavior analytic at that time. So being sort of looking at things more behaviorally that included verbal behavior, I realized that you can really explain largely most things in the world around us in terms of environment, motivative variables, and stimuli that affect behavior that either strengthen it or weaken it. And, that seemed like a real logical explanation to me about how people learn things and how things work, how they change, how you problem solve. So I was working in the public schools at the time as a speech pathologist, and I started thinking, well, what does this have to do with what I learned, which speech pathology programs traditionally train you as a cognitive person, looking at language as something that's inside your head, and it's our job to sort of get it out of there. But I really like that I can approach speech and language based on things that I could manipulate that were outside the skin, so to speak, like stimulus conditions and antecedents and consequences. And little by little, that began to produce better outcomes for my learners. Before that, I had really had difficulty sort of explaining language according to some kind of nebulous process inside a person to explain either why they did it or what, if they got it wrong, why did they get it wrong? Because they have an auditory processing disorder. Well, what do we do about that? Maybe they do. Maybe there is an auditory processor in there, but I didn't have access to it, as Skinner talked about. So what could I do about it? And then somewhere along the line, I met Mark Sundberg, and that was a sea change for me. He started talking about how you can assess language and how you can teach language more effectively and certainly more efficiently, like by using stimulus transfer procedures. And so I would go back to work on a Monday morning after being at one of his workshops on the weekend. And I was pretty wobbly at first, but gradually it got easier and easier. And I began to, implement more of a behavioral approach to the speech therapy that I was doing. And then when I started a consulting business for geriatric clients, people who had had strokes or head and neck injuries, well, not neck injuries, but head injuries, traumatic brain injury, that the behavioral approach was much more effective than whatever else I had in my toolbox. And then John and I moved to South Florida, and we started a consulting business when we lived down there. And at that point, I began to really focus the therapy that I was doing, a behavioral approach to speech and language, primarily with clients that had a diagnosis of autism. And then one evening, John and I went out for a walk in the neighborhood where we lived. And he said, when you're old, what will you wish you would have done? And there was not a nanosecond of space between his question and my response. And it was funny because I hadn't really thought about this consciously, I don't think. But I said, I know I will have wished that I would have gone back to Western and gotten my PhD in behavior analysis with Jack Michael and whoever else is there. And John said, well, then we have to make that happen. And so we did. We bought a little house near the university and I moved back up here and started my PhD program. And John commuted from South Florida back and forth. And gradually we realized that we wanted to be back in Michigan. And so he went from 3 weeks down there, 1 week up here to 2 weeks and 2 weeks. And then it pretty much flipped. And at some point we sold the house in Florida and here we are in Kalamazoo, Michigan, and then worked exclusively, mostly with autism clinics like the BACA in Indianapolis that Carl Sundberg and Devin Sundberg started, and some other clinics and private clients around the U.S. and then in some other countries as well.
I see. I've got a couple questions relative to that. One, I suppose, in the acknowledgments of the EESA booklet, there's a neat little quote where you talk about your experience at Western, and I think I have it right here. It says both Jack Michael and Jim Carr taught you how to think, talk, and live like a behavior analyst. And I just thought that was a really nice passage there. I'm wondering if you have any stories or examples relative to that with, whether it's feedback or conversations or interactions you might have had with either of those influences and mentors.
Yeah, I do. We were very lucky to live. The house that we bought here for me to live in when I was in the PhD program was right across the street from Jack Michael and his wife, Alice Dickinson. So we hung out a lot together. And then Jack was sort of thinking about retirement just as I came. And I think he was there 1 or 2 years and then he retired. And so I was taken under the wing of Jim Carr. And boy, was I lucky. That was an amazing experience to be in his lab. And so these two people, let me kind of back up and say that I was kind of coming into, the time when I met them. It's easy for all of us, I think, to internalize what's going on around us. I mean, we talk that way kind of in the vernacular, in everyday life. We describe things like, what's on your mind? Or you hurt my feelings, or these internal constructs that are, difficult to wrap your head around if you really want to do anything about them. So the real awakening for me, I think, was to be around people that talked about things differently, to people that understood contingencies, and they talked about environmental contingencies in terms of problem solving and so on, the effect on behavior that contingencies had. And, I guess Science and Human Behavior, as a title of Skinner's book, pretty much says it all, that human behavior can be advanced through the application of science. And so I observed that Jack Michael and Jim Carr, along with my husband and a few other strong behavior analysts that I had access to at the time, they talked about the environment. They talked about environmental events in a way that was sort of not traditional. They were very calm, very matter of fact, very thoughtful when things would pop up. And they would read a situation, they would react to it according to the contingencies that were in place at the time, not the emotions that were in place at the time. They were able to separate those. And so I would say that they didn't internalize problems. They were very solution oriented. They still are, except we unfortunately, sadly lost Jack. But these people, I observed, they didn't spin their wheels sort of with regret or guilt or recrimination. They would always sort of look forward and seek to move forward to negotiate whatever life was throwing at them. And I think their go-to response was not anger, not a power play, but just a very solution focused discussion. So I actually do have a couple of anecdotes, and they don't put me in in the best light, but boy, did I learn a lesson. And I don't mind sharing these because maybe they'll help somebody else. I think we all have had problems to deal with in life. So one day I was sitting over at Jack's in his kitchen. He lived in the basement of the house that they lived in. He had the whole basement to himself. And it was kind of like his little apartment. And so you could come and go by the garage door that was open. And lots of times people would come and go to play ping pong with him. He loved to do that. But anyway, I was telling him about this time a few years earlier when we were in South Florida, where I felt sort of depressed and unproductive. And I said, I just spent hours and hours just kind of ruminating about how crummy I felt. And I thought he was going to say, oh, there. And he didn't. He said, why did you do that? Why did you do that for more than just a few minutes? I mean, it doesn't seem very useful that's what you did. And he said, did it work? Did it make you feel better? And if it didn't work, why did you keep doing the same thing? At first I thought, well, he doesn't get it. He's just, he's not understanding what I'm saying. But then I thought, it's not that he wasn't compassionate. He just focused on a better solution and, to do something active and to let the feelings be whatever they are. And so, that really underscored for me that feelings and behavior are not the same thing. And that was a real new thought to me.
Hey everyone, if you're looking for some cool CEUs to check out, go to behavioruniversity.com and check out their ABA webinars. And if you do see something you like, you're going to want to grab it right away. I'm looking at a really interesting webinar, Practical Functional Assessment and Skills-Based Treatment, Introduction to Design Training. And that's by Dr. Joshua Jessel. It's taking place on February 8th. But unfortunately, it's sold out. But there's lots of other really great webinars coming up. So again, if you see something you like, you're going to want to hop on that opportunity right away. So to learn more about what they have to offer, go to behavioruniversity.com and just click on the webinars tab. Before you go there, though, make sure you go to behavioruniversity.com/observations to learn how to get a discount for podcast listeners. Okay, let's get back to the rest of this interview.
My anecdote about Jim Carr was also a real eye-opener, I think, about how to deal with a problem when it faces you. I was faced with a problem and he was faced with a problem and he handled it way better than I did. And so let me just tell you about that. I was in a class, one of his classes, a research class. And one day he said, I'm assigning you have to give a talk on whatever the topic was. And everybody in the class has 20 minutes to give their talk. And we'll meet ahead of time to make sure that your talk the scope can, be in 20 minutes and so on. And so when I went to grad school, I had already been out working in the field for a long time. And I had done a lot of 6-hour workshops and 3-hour workshops and all of that. So I'm embarrassed to say I went up to him after class and I said, Dr. Carr, I just wanted to sort of let you know that I'll need more than 20 minutes for my talk. And I know, I can't believe I did this. I can't believe I thought I even should do that, but he didn't laugh. He didn't do anything. He just very calmly stood there and looked at me with this, tell me more sort of a look. And so I said, because I'm used to giving 6-hour talks and 3-hour talks, and I'm pretty sure I'm not going to be able to do this in 20 minutes. So I'll need a different time slot. And so he said, okay, I see. And I said, oh, okay. So will you let me know when my longer time slot will be? And he said, you won't have a longer time slot and you'll have 20 minutes like everyone else. And I said, well, what do you mean? And I said, I thought you said you see. And he said, I see that you feel that you need more time. And essentially, he let the contingencies speak for themselves. And he was very calm about it. He didn't internalize my problem. He was respectful, but he was also firm. And he kept it kind of in the environment, not in the emotions. Like, he didn't even talk about what my needs were. He talked about what the contingencies were for this project. He was very kind, but he was also really clear. And it reminded me later at one point where our son had asked if he could borrow my car and go see his friends. And I said, yeah, you can take the car keys after you clean your room. And he said, well, I'll clean it when I get back. And I said, I don't want to clean it. And I said, okay, well, I get that you don't want to clean it. Okay. And he said, well, can I have the keys? And I said, no, the deal I'm offering is that you can have the car keys after you clean your room. I don't care whether you clean it or not, or when you clean it. But if you want the car keys, then this is the deal. You can take it or leave it. And the thing is that, what Jim did is it removed the power struggle. It removed the angst. And it really placed the onus of responsibility exactly where it needed to be.
It sounds like a page out of The Power of Positive Parenting of Glenn Latham's work, and I know that's
what a great book we've actually given that book to many folks. Yeah.
I there are people I would like to give it to. Let's just put it that way. But I'll just that's probably a story for a different time. But yeah. So yeah, you let the contingencies be the I guess the motivational the agent of change, if you will. So I definitely like that. And when I was laughing earlier, when I could I got to know Jim a little bit through the podcast and other things, and I can almost imagine his response to you asking for more time. That's why I wasn't laughing at the absurdity of asking for more time. I think that seems understandable based on how you set up the question. But yeah, I just imagining the response to that. That's where I thought that was pretty funny. But anyway, all right, I appreciate those stories. Those are pretty cool, and I think everyone loves hearing Jack stories as well. And especially as we more and more the field progresses, the fewer and fewer people will have had direct contact with them. So I love getting these anecdotes on out there for folks to hear. I only met him once in passing, but my impression was that he was the colorful guy that everyone reports. So I do want to. You mentioned earlier the EESA, the Early Echoic Skills and Assessment Program. We're going to get into what it is, all that stuff in a moment here. But I guess my first question about it, I guess for maybe some background, if you will, is what was the need you were trying to fill when you put this together? What was what problem were you trying to solve, or what hole in the marketplace, if you will, was that, does this assessment fill?
Well, there are two different answers. The first EESA that I wrote became part of the VB-MAPP. It became the echoic assessment in Mark Sundberg's VB-MAPP. And of course, without that, I wouldn't have then written this new, larger, Early Echoic Skills Assessment and Program Planner, this 2-manual set. But back in the day, I think this might have been around 2004, 2005, Mark was writing the VB-MAPP. And I mentioned to him that, in my opinion, the echoic part was a little light, that it didn't have sufficient items in there to effectively assess the echoic repertoire, and that it would be better if it were more comprehensive and more detailed. And he said, okay, well, how about you write it the way you think it should be? Be careful what you ask for, because I was in grad school at the time and I was trying to get a dissertation up and running, and I had so much on my plate. But, I couldn't believe this amazing opportunity that he threw my way. And I couldn't believe that it was coming at a time when, I already had so much to do. But I guess that has sort of become the norm, I think, for life. Anybody that has gone, I think, to university, and particularly graduate school, you ramp up your behavior in a really tight way and you get a lot done.
Oh, yes.
So Mark was very encouraging during that process with that first EESA. He provided excellent feedback. And the same for the EESAPP, calling it the Early Echoic Skills Assessment and Program Planner. He's been there every step of the way, and his feedback is always spot on. So what happened was I started getting feedback from folks, and we solicited some of it through a SurveyMonkey a few years ago. What is it about this one-page EESA assessment in the VB-MAPP that's working for you, but more importantly, what is not working for you? And we got on the SurveyMonkey over 100 responses, and that, the overwhelming comment that we saw over and over again was, okay, I've assessed this learner's skill in imitating vocally, but now what do? I still don't know how to teach them to talk. And so all I've got is a number, and I plug the number into the VB-MAPP, but I don't really know what to do next. And so I started then working on something that was much more comprehensive, and then realized that it can't just be what was a 1-page test is now a 5-page test. But there's also a guidebook with, an introduction that talks about typical speech and language development. What does that look like? How do you view that from a behavioral perspective, a functional perspective, like man syntax and interverbals, as opposed to a linguistic perspective, like plurals and past tense and all of those sorts of things, which are very interesting and do have a place, but starting with developing a functional verbal repertoire, I think then you can superimpose those kinds of kind of like frosting on the cake.
Right. Structural elements, perhaps.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. So that's the story of the EESA 1 and the EESAPP, along with the revised echoic test.
Are you looking for a new job, but you're overwhelmed with all the emails that you're getting from ABA agencies? What if there was someone who was in your corner and could help you find the perfect job placement? Well, that person exists. Barbara Voss has been working as a recruiter for over 30 years, and her company, HRIC, specializes in placing BCBAs in permanent full-time positions throughout the United States. Barbara has been placing BCBAs since 2011, so she knows our business, and she offers personalized service to any BCBA looking for a new position. She also helps companies looking to hire BCBAs too. Here are just some of the things Barbara can help you with. She can provide information about salary ranges in different markets across the country. She can help you write your resume. She can coordinate and prepare you for the interview process, and even help negotiate the right salary for you. And best of all, there are no charges to any candidate for all of these services. When you're ready to make a change and want to work with someone who will listen to you and understand what you need in a new position, contact Barbara at HRIC. To schedule a confidential discussion, head over to hricolorado.com. Again, that's hricolorado.com, and hit the contact button to connect with Barbara. You won't be disappointed. One thing I am curious about is that whenever there's, there are, discussions of some of the elements that are in here. I don't have a speech background. My background's in experimental psychology. So whenever I look at something like this, I get almost a little bit of trepidation, if you will, because I'm unfamiliar with some of the terminology and things like that. Are there, and I guess more broadly, outside the scope of the assessment, are there concepts, terms, things like that from the speech therapy world that you think behavior analysts should be more conversant in, or that would help them in their practice, whether it's implementing something like the EESAPP or in other aspects of their work?
Well, I'm trying to think of what I've observed behavior analysts doing that's related to teaching people to speak, that it would be nice if they knew about this body of information. And, I should probably throw in at this point that my perspective is that we are all responsible to some degree for helping learners learn to speak. There are parents that certainly teach children to speak, and they don't have a degree in speech pathology or behavior analysis, or if they don't, they still manage to get it done. The verbal community of the learner, kind of everybody has some skin in the game on this. It's to our advantage to teach people to speak. I do think that, so I don't think anybody owns the right or the responsibility to tackle this problem. That said, yeah, there are some things that it would be nice if everybody, not just behavior analysts, but if people sort of had a better concept of. One of those is what does typical speech development look like? And that is what is and is not a speech problem. So, and the other one is something called co-articulation that I'll explain. I can explain that briefly, but these are sort of related issues. One of the common problems that I see people who aren't speech pathologists try to do when they're teaching someone to speak is they will either break it up when it shouldn't be separated and segmented out, or they'll work on a single consonant sound, like say B kind of thing. And if you are already a fluent speaker, that's fine to clean up the articulation. I had to go to speech therapy when I was an undergrad because I had a lisp. And they said, yeah, it would be good if you could get rid of that lisp before you start to help other people not lisp. But for the kinds of kids that I've been focusing on, or the kinds of learners, it doesn't matter how old they are, they could be 20 or 2. If they don't have the basic speech development skills that a typically developing infant has, then that's the first thing that we want to work on. We want to get that in place. Lots of vocalizations, fluently produced, not slowly produced, not single sounds. And the vowels end up being pretty much on the money pretty early. And so do the number of syllables. And the verbal community accepts imprecision with consonant sounds for years. That's called baby talk. And so it would be nice, I think, if folks had a really clear understanding of, for example, I'm not sure what the ages are now, but the last time that I was involved in public school work, we were not able to certify as a speech problem an S problem, like a list, like saying soup for soup kind of thing, until the child was over the age of 5. And, yet I see, very early speakers in with a diagnosis of autism where, well-meaning therapists are trying to get these people to make these single consonant sounds when we would never do that with a typically developing early speaker. We would pretty much let the imprecision be what it is with consonants, but we would go for fluency. So the verbal community prioritizes speed over precision with with early speakers. We accept a lot of imprecision in how we talk in favor of saying it fast. So that kind of brings me then to this term we call co-articulation. It's the process of making adjustments of where your tongue is in your mouth, or how you scrunch words together or syllables together, kind of shortcuts that we take when we're speaking normally to accommodate that talking fast. Co-articulation has to do with how we pronounce things based on the sounds that are on both sides of the sound that we're saying. So for example, there's the word balance. And if you want to say that somebody is not balanced, you wouldn't say that they're imbalanced. You'd say they're imbalanced. And so that's an accommodation that we make, because the B is made with the two lips together, and so is the M made that way. So it's very quick to say imbalance instead of in balance, where you have to make that N sound with your tongue behind your upper teeth, and then go to get your tongue out of the way and make that B sound. It's faster to say it. So, for example, some other examples are improper, where the M and the P are in the same place. And on the flip side of that, we say intake, not imtake, or we don't say inept, we say inept, because of the speed that can be maintained. And I think these are just conventions that have come down over the years. We say, for example, education instead of education, or we say thank you instead of than you. So that's called co-articulation. And when people understand that, they stop trying to get children or learners, early speech learners, to make isolated sounds. They respect that sounds occur in a string of syllables, and that's what needs to be maintained. I would rather have an early speaker that you can't understand what they're saying, but they're saying long strings of syllables with pretty much a lot of vowel sounds and kind of that, pitch going up and down like normal, the music of language called prosody, because you can clean up the articulation later. But by slowing it down and separating out, every little sound that you're trying to get the child to say, you'll never have it. It's unlikely to contact the contingencies of reinforcement, because it's so not the way it's supposed to sound. And so the verbal community will be unlikely to reinforce those kinds of, and also it's unlikely that it will happen without prompts, which is something that, we'd like to get rid of.
Hey everyone, as a BCBA, meeting your continuing ed needs can be challenging at times. That's why I have made selected episodes of the Behavioral Observations podcast available for Type 2 continuing education credits. That's right. You can meet a portion of your professional development requirements on the go. Currently, we have CEs for topics including functional assessment, ethics, and supervision. Come learn from podcast favorites such as Greg Hanley, Pat Fryman, Mark Dixon, as well as many other amazing guests. For more information, head on over to behavioralobservations.com/get-CEs. So those are some great examples, and definitely the saying "you learn something new every day" certainly applies to me in this conversation. So I'm grateful for that. At the risk of a kind of inartful segue here, I suppose, is I did want to talk a little bit about what you want to talk about at the Verbal Behavior Conference that's coming up. So I want to make sure we don't forget to discuss that. So I know you've got not one, but two talks at the Verbal Behavior Conference that's coming up at the end of February. It's February 29th and March 1st. So if people want to spend leap year with you and the rest of the speakers who are going to be there, and we've got a great lineup this year, they can go to behaviorlive.com/VBC to learn more. So having teed that up, what I suppose you're going to be talking about some aspects of assessment, but kind of fill us in about what your talks are going to touch on, if you don't mind.
Yeah, I hope lots of people do come to Austin. The week after that, I think, is the South by Southwest Music Festival. Yeah, so why not take another week off and stay there for that, right? So they have me scheduled for 2 talks. I think each one is maybe an hour or an hour and a half. And on the first day, I'm going to kind of take folks through an overview of the new EESAPP. There's a guidebook that has some chapters in it, and it has some appendices, like some printable forms that people can use in their programming, some IEP information, some information about this thing called syllable complexity that is then going to lead into day 2, the talk. Syllable complexity is what we're measuring with the EESA test, as opposed to an articulation test where you're scoring whether the person said it right or not. We are scoring some of that, or if they're in the ballpark. But what we really are analyzing then later is we're coding the responses according to this thing called syllable complexity, which has to do with why people make articulation errors in the first place. How many syllables in the string, how many different vowels, and how many different consonants. So, for example, if I said to you, which word do you think is harder to say, mama or mommy? You might say, I don't know, they're the same. But mama has one consonant and one vowel in 2 syllables. It's a reduplicated same syllable said twice. Mommy has one consonant, but 2 different vowels. So we've introduced another level of complexity for the learner. And so if errors happen, like, for example, if I say to a child, say butterfly, and they say fafa or fafai, why did that happen? Well, because there are either too many syllables, too many different consonants. I think butterfly has 5 different consonant sounds, 5 or 6, or maybe too many different vowels. So instead of just looking at they said it wrong, we want to know sort of that next level of analysis and then we want to find a sweet spot where, okay, they can handle this level of complexity, but not this. And so now we've got our shaping steps that we can just follow until we get correct responding to the terminal target. So that's what I'm going to be talking about.
Sounds fascinating. So folks want to check that out. And if you're not local to Austin, or if you don't have the opportunity to make the trip, it's available remotely through the magic of behaviorlive.com. And I've been to a number of events with Behavior Live. They do a really fantastic job broadcasting the conference in, just very high quality audio and videos. And one of the things that I think is cool about the Verbal Behavior Conference is that it's a very small, intimate setting, and there's lots of opportunity for attendees. I'm sure a lot of people are going to be hitting you up during coffee breaks and things like that, asking you questions and whatnot. And it's small enough to do that without, overwhelming people and so forth. We'll also be doing a panel discussion that I'll be moderating at the end of the first day. So if there are questions that you want to have the speakers elaborate on, I get the chance to ask your questions. So check out the Verbal Behavior Conference at behaviorlive.com/VBC. Okay. Thank you for letting us know what you're going to talk about at the conference. Again, it sounds really, really fascinating, and I'm looking forward to it. I guess related to the ESAPP, one question I have about it is, kind of like the boundary conditions, if you will, of who is it for and who is it not for? So if people are listening and they're like, oh, I've got learners who generally fall within these parameters of, what fill in the blank or whatever, who would be an ideal learner to help with this type of thing. And then, obviously if there are areas where people can test out or whatever, I'd be curious to hear what the range of what an appropriate participant would be.
Yeah, that's great. I'm so glad you asked that, because people do want to know that. I think goal in working on speech development with an early speaker is to sort of launch them, to get them to be able to produce strings of syllables at a syllable complexity level that the verbal community will, in other words, it has enough variation, enough different consonants and enough different vowels sounds that you can make words with it. and that the verbal community can then, have something to reinforce. And the goal, of course, is not to develop an echoic repertoire just for the echoic sake, but to use it as an echoic prompt that the learner can benefit from in the context of a managed or attacked or an interverbal. So that's the goal. And so once they can do that, produce multiple fluently produced syllables in a string with, a sufficient level of syllable complexity, a few different consonant sounds, a few different vowel sounds, then they're good to go. And you can get out of the way and let the natural contingencies of daily life reinforce their speech development. But getting there is kind of the concern. And so that's the goal of the EESA test, is to identify what is it that we need to do with speakers that have some beginning speech skills, but not at the level that I just described. And so in terms of exclusion or inclusion, if they're not at the sort of the baseline level, then they're pre-echoic, not ready. You'd be wasting your time to do the EESA. And so what I did it's in the guidebook, and it's also a printable form, is called the EESAPP pretest. And so you can read about that and say, my learner doesn't really vocalize that much. And I'm never sure if I say, penny, say doggy, say pizza, say cookie, that they'll say anything. It may be premature to give them the EESA test. But there are some things that you can do written into the EESAPP guide that tells you, well, if I have a learner at this sort of pre-echoic level, what do I do to get them ready to be a participant with this assessment? So we provided that kind of information. On the other end of the spectrum are the ones who have already launched who there is no need to give them this assessment because they already have sufficient syllable complexity, sufficient variation in all the different phonemes, all the different sounds that they put into a connected utterance, that the contingencies of reinforcement from the verbal community will play out just fine. That's an important point to recognize with the learner. Maybe they don't even need it. And there is some direction in the EESAPP in chapter 3 that talks about the administration guidelines for the test, that if you have a learner at such and such a level, it's possible that you can skip this subtest or these first 2 subtests, give full credit, and then move into the higher subtests of the EESA-R. So that would be important for people to be able to pinpoint.
That sounds very helpful. One other thing I want to ask you about before I let you go here. I know we're coming up on some of the time we had set aside to do this, but I want to get this in is, what are some common mistakes or challenges that you've seen people when there are struggles they might have when doing the EESA, or, whether it's the, kind of the original version that was packaged with the VB-MAPP, or, or things that you might imagine people might encounter with this new assessment, package. Well, so what are some of those challenges, and what might be some possible solutions to them?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the biggest issue that has come about, and I do speak to it in the EESAPP guide, is that there are people who would like to use the test items as the targets that they're actually teaching their learner. I can understand why people want to do that, because they want, the next time they give this test, they want the person to say it well and to have a higher score. But if you buy into the idea that the test is to identify skill with syllable complexity and not a specific topography or a specific word, then that would be the way to go. For example, one of the words in group 3 subtest is tahini. And tahini is chosen because it has 3 syllables. It's in group 3. It has 3 syllables. It has a certain syllable complexity level, a certain number of different consonants, different number of different vowel sounds, number of different consonant sounds, which is what syllable complexity is. It was only chosen for that. And because our focus in the EESAPP program is to develop a non-echoic verbal repertoire, vocal verbal repertoire in mands, tags, interverbals, things that sort of have more payoff than just you said it well, good for you, that have more power language-wise. We want folks to clearly understand that the targets that they choose have to meet the letter of the law in terms of syllable complexity, but they also have to be important to the learner. They have to be either something that the learner encounters every day, likes, wants to say, needs to say. And so, if their family doesn't eat tahini, never bought tahini, don't like tahini, whatever, then why would you choose that as one of your targets? You can choose another word that has the same syllable complexity with value, adding up the numbers of different syllables, different consonant sounds, different vowel sounds. So let's say that a word that the word had a syllable complexity value of 7, but that word is not something that has any bearing on this learner's life. Then make up a different word for a target that has that same syllable complexity value, and that will be much more meaningful and be more likely to contact the contingencies of reinforcement. The there are two other really short things that we see happening where people continue the testing situation after the learner doesn't want to be there anymore. They're bored. They've had it. They're not responding well. They're unhappy. And certainly there's guidance in the EESAPP program for what to do about that. The short answer is take a break and
spoiler alert.
Another time. And then the other thing that I think speech therapists know not to do, but it's not necessarily included that other people would know, is that when you're giving the model, don't exaggerate it. So if the word is puppy, you're not going to say puppy. You're going to say puppy, that type of thing. And because, again, we want fluently produced connected syllables, not separated syllables, so that they can take advantage of that naturally occurring co-articulation.
Great. Those are helpful. Those are helpful tips. All right. Well, I look forward to seeing you in Austin in just a few short weeks and learning more about this work and your talks, certainly. And so I think what I'd like to do is just let you take us out with some advice you might have for a newly minted BCBA or newly minted speech pathologist, or anyone else who's wants to do good work in this field.
Yeah. Well, maybe a couple of things. If you're interested in helping learners learn to speak, this is something that you can do. It's you're going to start where you start, and we all did that. And you're going to continue to acquire skills. It's difficult. It's probably the hardest thing, or one of the hardest things that you'll ever do, but it's very friendly to behavior analysis because speech acquisition is really molecular. It's very pinpointed. There are a lot of little details, and generally behavior analysts like that. And I know speech pathologists do. So that kind of precision and zeroing in on the things that you need to zero in on. Don't get overwhelmed by the enormity of the task. Start small and do what you can do and build your repertoire. The other thing I think, though, more broadly that I'd like to encourage new folks to do is to stay close to the science. It's really easy when you're working in a clinic and you're, trying to get reports written and lessons planned and everything, to sort of fall into this sing-song, one size fits all sort of thing, and take a more technical approach as opposed to an analytic approach. You may feel like a technician sometimes, but you've got a scientific background. And so I would encourage you to use it and think about the analysis part. If you can analyze why an error occurred, whether the error is running away or saying the word wrong or crying or, circling the wrong item on a worksheet, there are a lot of sort of errors. Whatever those are, you have the skills, if you are a BCBA or and an SLP, I think as well, to analyze the conditions where those errors occurred and then begin to look for some options in the stimulus conditions. And that's called error analysis. And it keeps you firmly rooted in the science and definitely not just following a recipe or a cookbook to be a technician.
All right. Those are great words to leave the audience with. Dr. Barbara Esch, thanks so much for joining me today.
Thanks, Nat. It was great.
Thank you for listening to the Behavioral Observations Podcast with Matt Sikoria. You can find Matt's notes on this episode at www.behavioralobservations.com. We also invite you to stay connected with us on Facebook at facebook.com/behavioral observations and on Twitter at Behavior Podcast.